Good evening. Tonight is Friday, November 8th, 2013, and you are joining us for our weekly webcast on LaRouchepack.com. These webcasts happen every Friday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and they feature a dialogue with Mr. Lyndon LaRouche. Now, I'm joined tonight by Dennis Mason, and together we will be posing a series of questions that have come in from various sources. And Mr. LaRouche will be given an opportunity to respond to these. Now, Lynn, I'm going to begin with a question that's come in from an institutional contact based in Washington, D.C. And the question is as follows. It reads, Mr. LaRouche, this question is a follow-up to last week. Some dramatic developments have taken place this week in the Middle East, including the revelation that Saudi Arabia has a long-standing deal with Pakistan to obtain a nuclear weapon, and the reported progress in Geneva today at the P5+1 talks. As you know, Secretary of State Kerry has arrived in Geneva after a confrontational meeting in Tel Aviv with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. And Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is to arrive in Geneva Saturday morning for a third day of talks that could result in the signing of an interim deal. Can you please give us your assessment of this situation and the strategic implications?
This is a very complicated and complicating issue. It's also of deadly import. It can be a fizzle, or it can be a crisis of several different kinds of varieties. Already the people who are being concerned to coming in on these negotiations are increasing. And you have the direct negotiations that's in public, and you have those things which will come up in negotiations, diplomatic negotiations, or behind the scenes. It's dangerous. But on the other hand, you have to put it in perspective, because already the situation is dangerous without this being brought into play now. It could be a solution, technically, possibly, because apart from what Israel is doing, Israel's chief head of state, government is, that's a mess. It's a very deadly mess, because it's demanding concessions that cannot be given. Israel cannot get those concessions. They'll have to be a little more modest. Besides, we're all on the edge of thermonuclear war. Therefore, these bringing out some little petty issue, like Obama's, problems and so forth, is really not too important right now, because we've reached the point that we're on the verge of a, August, Guns of August situation. And this is much worse than the Guns of August, obviously, because this is thermonuclear. Everybody's involved, directly or indirectly. On the other side, this comes as a possibly opportune occasion, because we're already on the danger of a war between Pakistan and India. That's already on the desk. And therefore, anything to clear the air and settle some of these things would be quite useful, and maybe take thermonuclear war off the desk at the same time. But I'm not going to bother being worried. The time for being worried is past. The time for taking action to prevent what could happen is now. You just think of the nations involved. The United States is obviously heavily involved in this thing, not only through the Secretary of State, but through other channels. And I'm not sure that Obama agrees with what the Secretary of State is trying to do. So this is a deadly, serious situation which can explode into thermonuclear war. And the intervention with Pakistan against India, that is the one that may set the whole thing off. Just think of the nations which are on the pivot right now. You have this could go into thermonuclear war, global thermonuclear war. And on the other hand, if they start to give in to this poor Israeli idiot who's making a mess of everything out of his own nasty little nastiness, And he could be the spark plug which actually sets this thing in motion. Because obviously, what's going on in the area, the issues are so tight. We're on the verge that if any real crisis occurs, it could turn into a thermonuclear crisis, thermonuclear confrontation. And a thermonuclear confrontation now is almost certain, because when you take China's involved, India's involved, Russia's involved, and then a lot of people in the United States is heavily involved. We could be in a thermonuclear war. I'm not saying that we will be in a thermonuclear war. All the preconditions for it are there. And the lack of any clear indication of a way in which a negotiation could be pulled off. Obviously, what is being demanded by Israel is insane. He's just being a provocateur. There's nothing good in his argument. And I always go back to my old friends in Israel who were of a different party than now, and they were, they'd gone through a period of wars and they finally came to the view, hey, we're nuts. What are we fighting these guys for? What we need is peace. We need to build up our economy. And I came into contact with them again. I had been in contact with them just before. Some people went to Israel and asked me to do something for them. So I did. It didn't amount to much. But then later, in the later period, it got serious because I was quite seriously involved with the Israelis on that other party side. And they were looking for the right thing. And the reason I really was interested in them, because I thought that they were doing the right thing, given the whole Middle East mess and so forth, and the Israeli problems. So this is a very dangerous situation. I don't want to even imply that I'm going to exaggerate it in any way. I'm just saying we have two alternatives. This, in one extreme, could go all the way to crisis, real crisis, because the Saudi Arabians are in that, and also the British are involved in this, or one faction of the British. And if they start to push their line, then you've got a detonator. And it could be thermonuclear war. Why? Not because of this issue alone, but because the threat of thermonuclear war already exists. And Obama is one of the big drivers, and the British, one faction of the British, the Saudi-linked faction of the British. And that is the great danger. So people who want to be serious in governments should get serious. We know who the provocateurs are that wish this kind of thermonuclear confrontation. What we have to do is gang up against them and make sure they don't do anything, because otherwise we could be very quickly in the countdown to thermonuclear war, and we don't want to go there.
John F. Kennedy, in a speech he gave to the United Nations 50 years ago, said that a nuclear sword of Damocles is hanging over the head of every man, woman, and child on this planet by a very thin thread which could be cut at any moment. And we're certainly at the point where that thread could be cut. Let me just elaborate on some of the developments from this past week. As people saw, at the end of last week, there were articles published by the Chinese press, which were then picked up and amplified in the U.S. press, the Washington Times, where China went public for the first time concerning their strategic nuclear submarine fleet. The articles included detailed graphics that showed that with the strategic fleet that the Chinese have, they can reach any city on the west coast of the United States with radiation going all the way into the Midwest, and then couple that with the land forces, the ICBMs, which could be launched across the North Pole to hit cities on the East Coast. Now, the Chinese made very clear that they weren't announcing this for any other reason then that this option would only be considered as a counterattack strategy. People's Daily quoted a top military expert from China who said, only if our opponents use nuclear weapons to attack us will we use nuclear weapons to attack them. But clearly, this is a stark indication of the fact that China clearly comprehends that the nature of the threat is directed against them. Obama's so-called air-sea battle program and all the rest. This announcement from China came at the same time that President Putin ordered his fourth no-notice snap exercise of Russia's air and missile defense systems, the fourth this year, where 2 ICBMs and 2 submarine-launched missiles were live fired during the exercise, in addition to 15 other defensive missiles, which Putin himself oversaw the exercise. And of course, now we've got the story from Saudi Arabia, the Saudis possessing de facto control over a portion of the nuclear arsenal of Pakistan. Now, what you said earlier this week on Monday was that we're at the point now where the mechanisms for peace are breaking down. The usual relationship between leading powers of the planet are in a phase of breakdown. And this is both with the impending collapse of the financial system in the transatlantic countries and with this breakdown of what you called the so-called mechanisms for peace. And this is what's setting us on the trend towards thermonuclear war. What else you said was that it was only through the immediate removal of this president from office for constitutional cause, impeachment, that we could bring this process to a halt. And you put it on the cowardice of the Democratic Party, especially the Democrats in the United States Senate, that are creating the danger that this nuclear sword of Damocles could come down. So I wanted to give you a chance to elaborate on this question.
Well, it's obvious. First of all, you have to look at what Obama represents. He represents genocide. But he's not his own man. He's a stooge of the Queen of England. And it's her, and just take it seriously this time. Her policy has been, since the period of the Copenhagen negotiations, has been genocide. Her policy has been to reduce the human population rapidly from 7 billion people to 1 or less. That policy is now being carried out in the food supply in the United States. That is the policy that is being carried out by the president in his other policies, economic policies. This president is already committed to genocide against people, a large mass of the people of the United States. And he goes further. Now, you've come to one of those impossible situations. Either the Senate goes ahead and tells them to cut that crap out, stop it, because that's going to lead to genocide. But the problem is that some of our members of the Congress, the Senate in particular, are so cowardly, or so foolish, or so stupid that they fail to recognize what the significance of this situation is. And I know some of these people. I know of them otherwise. And it's impossible. Our former president who was once a good man, is now gone apparently crazy. He's no sense of reality whatsoever, because he's trying to compromise with compromises and compromises. And this is not a good idea under these kinds of circumstances. So the time has come that we have to have a change in the policy of the United States government. The removal of President Obama is feasible on 2 grounds. First of all, he deserves to be thrown out rapidly and without question. And secondly, he's not fit to be president. And therefore, he should be removed from office. that action by the United States government of impeaching this president would probably be the best thing that could happen to secure the world as a whole from a growing threat of global thermonuclear war. And that has to be taken seriously, because there are lots of things that are not pre-calculable precisely. But when you see the tension is increasing, and you look at the conditions in the United States, you look at what's being done to murder American citizens in the name of health care, in the name of food supplies, all these kinds of things. So the time has come to make a very bold strike. This guy's a crook. He should be thrown out for the crimes he's committed. Get him out of there and change the president. That is the best solution, because that would put the damper on the situation. Throwing him out of office, which he fully deserves, he more than deserves. The nation deserves to be free of this guy. And that has to be seriously considered, not as a proposal, but as an action of necessity. If we don't, look, if we go, how far do you think the people of this nation are going to accept being starved to death, or put in a position where they don't eat because they're trying to feed their children, where the health insurance policy is impossible? You're creating impossibly mass murderous conditions in the United States in the name of this guy. And then he has the boldness to admit he was lying on this very policy. Now, I think a president who admits that he was boldly doing this ought to resign out of decency, or he should be thrown out of office. And I do mean thrown.
Okay, I actually have a question on the food situation and the potential of civil strife. With the cuts to the food stamp program, or SNAP, what you had said earlier in the year is becoming very stark. You had said that without a change, people would be facing starvation within the territory of the United States, and that is now happening. And this affects not only the abject poor, but many families in what remains of the middle class rely on these programs, whether it be food stamps, reduced cost and free school lunches, food pantries. They rely on these in order to make ends meet and provide adequate nutrition for their children, and then, if there's enough left over, for themselves. One report has it that 1 in every 7 Americans make use of the SNAP program. Now, even without the cuts to the food programs, the fact of the matter is, as far as food production is concerned, we no longer have the capability to sustain ourselves as a nation. And if we continue in this direction, we will irretrievably lose that capacity. Now, along these lines, there have been reports of a possible civil strife in the making, with reports coming in that the Department of Homeland Security has been preparing for this kind of thing with, billions of bullets purchased. There was a report of a town in Minnesota where there's more chemical suits at the depot than there are citizens to wear them. There are these kinds of anecdotes. But in any event, the reality on the ground is that come the end of the month, when things are the tightest, when needy families visit the food pantries, the food will simply not be there. And people involved in coordinating these food banks are very worried about that. And when you look at the beginning of what came to be called the Arab Spring, when you look at Egypt, the catalyst was primarily food. It was youth unemployment. It was the clouding over of hope in the future. Now, these conditions are here in the United States right now. In our organizing around the nation, we find that there's a lot of anger in the streets. So can you address this potential for an explosion among the people of the United States?
Well, don't worry about the people of the United States, because the people of the United States will be affected by this in any case. So it's not just the United States. We're in a situation. Look at the decline in food supplies in the United States and other parts of the world. Look at it. Don't worry about the case of the United States. We don't have to argue that. People are being killed all over the world. Especially, look, the basic killing was concentrated in Europe and also in the United States. with less impact in the United States so far, but in Europe very strongly. In Italy, it's worse than it is in France. And it's worse than, both are worse than in the case of Germany. Now, the only reason Germany is in less bad straits than France and other countries in Europe is because the German economy has always been based on being an export economy. Now, why does it have to be an export economy? Why do they do that? They've done it ever since Bismarck. That's been the German policy. Why? Well, because they were being blockaded by the British and the French. And therefore, what happened is they had to produce enough food or control enough food and goods and produce enough goods to make the fact that they were faced constantly with blockades of one kind or another. So that's what's happened now. Germany is still being attacked from the United States and elsewhere on the accusation that they're getting too much back. But Germany has always known that it had to overproduce its own domestic needs in order to secure its position. And that's a long-standing German policy. And it's not a sneaky policy at all. It's a very simple one. They know that their neighbors will try to destroy them, usually through British influence. And the way they got rid of this problem for a while was they kicked Bismarck out of office. And Bismarck's going out of office led quickly to the assassination of the French president, and to the starting of a war, a world war. And this led immediately, it's short term after Bismarck was kicked out of office, which was ordered by the British. And this led very quickly to a chain reaction, which became known as World War I. But there were some intermediate developments, like the wars in Asia, which were, this was part of it, the Japan War. It was all part of the same thing. And so that's the policy nature of the matter. Now, therefore, we have to understand that the British Empire has not gone away. What it represents has not gone away. The British Empire includes Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the most criminal state nation in the world as a whole. But it's a stooge for the British. And Saudi Arabia is simply a stooge of the British. They're the ones who ran 9/11, and we had the Bush family, presidents, they're criminals. They did it. They set it up, and they covered it up. They put the rule in that you can't disclose where the weapons came from for 9/11. We know where they came from. There's no secret. It came from the Anglo-Dutch organization and the Saudis. The organization is known, the personalities are known, the leaders who did this to the United States, and we had the Bush family acted under law to cover that up. The Bush family acted under law to keep a secret of what 9/11 had been. But the evidence is already known. 9/11 was done by the Saudis in collaboration with the British monarchy. That's a fact. And you've got these guys running around saying, no, that's not true because we didn't allow that information to be given. So this is the kind of situation we really have to put in focus. Because it's not this thing or it's not that thing. This is global. This is global. It's a war which the Queen of England has declared repeatedly to reduce the human population rapidly from 7 billion people to 1 or less. That is the policy of the British monarchy and the policy of the Saudi kingdom, among some others. That's the truth. So therefore, everybody in the United States who's in government has access, that is into the federal government, has access to leakage of this fact, of this set of facts. But the problem is many of our senators and others are stinking cowards. They will not tell the truth, even when the existence of the United States is in jeopardy, like all those people who are sitting there and not doing anything about these crimes against humanity, against the United States. That's the way you have to look at it. So you say, what do we got out there? Are gutless wonders? Are they all bought off? Are they all simply crooks? But people who say they have dignity, people who claim they have authority, and they make a prostitute seem a hero.
Okay, this next question is actually from a fairly high-level bank regulator from Austria. Comes via Harley Schlanger. This is the question. Harley says, I spoke with a contact who is a bank regulator in Austria, who is very concerned about the EU single resolution mechanism. He read Leandra Bernstein's report on the bail-in, Dodd-Frank kills, which he first dismissed, saying, Cyprus is a special case. However, he just returned from meetings in Frankfurt and said that he can see that they are serious about the single resolution mechanism, and it worries him greatly. He said that this will give more power to the ECB to shut down relatively liquid savings banks and regional banks, to seize their liquidity for the big banks, which he said he believes is part of the bail-in strategy. The problem for the big banks, he said, is not illiquidity. They are liquid to the point of hyperinflation, thanks to the ECB bailouts, but insolvency. This is causing much more discussion about Glass-Steagall among the relevant circles in Austria, but he said that he doesn't see how a nation in the European Union, such as Austria, would be allowed to implement Glass-Steagall. And he asks you if you have any suggestions for them.
Well, it's come right now. It comes around and hits you in the back of the head when you're trying to avoid it in front. And that's what the situation is. They have no way of escaping this. They cannot continue to exist if they tolerate this. That's the point. If they shut the thing you're in already in the world, you're in a degree of hyperinflation, which reminds you of 1933 Germany. And that's the condition out there. These guys are all bankrupt, really. But they're pretending that they're not. Now, obviously, this is going to come to a breakdown point. It could happen easily this year, still. And it's been on the edge of that. Because these banks, these large banks, with the transatlantic region in particular, are hopelessly bankrupt. Totally bankrupt now. What they're trying to do is bluff their way through to cancel all the debts they owe and take everything over, using the larger banks of this type as the vehicles to rake in all the assets, all the financial assets, which are not really assets. But if they're the only survivor in the system, that means they own everything. Now, this comes to the question of the thermonuclear war. If you start to run this kind of policy, what's the reaction? There is no limit to which nations will go to destroy those who are trying to destroy them. And now you're talking about thermonuclear warfare. Now look at World War I, for example. Now, World War I actually started the day that Bismarck was kicked out of office. But they killed the president of France first, and some other things like that. But they got into a countdown process which led inevitably to what we call World War I. You're in a comparable situation now in much more advanced form. You have a plan now publicly is to starve an increasing part of our population to death. That's the policy of this president, Obama. He's a mass murderer by intention. Just look at his so-called health care policies and related policies. But you find you don't have people in government who in total have the guts to do anything about it. And the whole world is in that situation, that kind of tension. The world is at the breaking point. And what happens in this particular negotiation, which is now ongoing this weekend, is simply a typification of how this can blow. Because you already have the Saudis have set up Pakistan for a nuclear attack on India. What are you going to do about that? That's how far it's gone. But what people try to cheat you and fool you by raising this issue and tell you how that can be fixed, that issue and how that can be fixed, and so forth and so on. We've now run out of those kinds of options. We're on a tension point where we can either make a radical change in the situation or go into thermonuclear war. And if you look at the way, World War I actually broke out, the Guns of August, that was not supposed to happen according to the mythology. The same thing happened with Hitler. It wasn't supposed to happen under Hitler. He was supposed to be the good guy, right? And all the British bankers told us that. So it's this kind of deception which poor stupid people take in, allow themselves to be confused and almost lost of their own very brains. And then they find themselves in the jug. They find themselves in the hold. And we're in that situation. Either we are going to have a radical change of the type I would approve of soon, and very soon, or we're going to go to hell. That's what it amounts to. And you're seeing that with the negotiations now on what we're getting in the Middle East now, that hot button. We're on the edge of a potential breakout of general warfare under thermonuclear conditions. And when you get to this level, you don't have any more leeway for negotiations. You have to do something to change this situation suddenly, which means you're going to bankrupt a lot of things that don't need any money anyway, or don't deserve it if they needed it.
All right. Well, I have a question that's come up on Obamacare and bail-in and bail-out. With the implementation of Obamacare, there's been a lot of noise about the fact that people who were told that they would be able to hold on to their current insurance policies have had those policies invalidated and are faced with obtaining new qualified policies. And many people find that if they try to stay within the same price range, they suffer a drastic cut in services and a hike in their copay, whereas if they try to keep the same quality of coverage, the premium is just too much to bear. This has received a lot of attention. Now, another side of this is what amounts to using Obamacare as a pass-through for the federal government to fund the insurance companies directly. Tens of millions of people who are currently covered and tens of millions more who are expected to enroll under the mandate will qualify for government subsidies. EIR has estimated this to be in the range of some $130 billion per year in what is, for all intents and purposes, a bailout of the insurance companies. Now, those who don't qualify for subsidies will simply have to find a way to pay the higher premiums out of their own pockets, which is in effect a mandated bail-in, where people's assets are essentially leveraged, stolen, to sustain the financiers. Now, adding this revenue to the other, the estimate is in the range of $300 billion per year handed straight to the insurance companies as a consequence of Obamacare. Now, when you add to this the takedown of the medical system, the closure of hospitals, the cutting of doctors, nurses, emergency personnel, and all with the apology, the excuse that this is what is necessary to make things profitable and sustainable, we are looking at the physical and real expression of what was put on trial and convicted in Nuremberg after the war. Accounting measures are not a valid defense for crimes against humanity. When the defendants tried to hide behind the mask of policy, the verdict came down saying known or should have known. Merely carrying out orders or merely implementing a policy as coming down from above does not absolve you of morality or of criminality. But these are effects. The cutting of the care is an effect. The bail-in, the bail-out looting, that's an effect. Dealing with the effects without dealing with the intention is like trying to attack the rattle of a rattlesnake. So the question for you is how to most effectively go after the root of the problem.
It's a rather simple thing, but it takes a few words to get it put across. There is no reason that we have to bail out and subsidize any of these financial institutions which are engaged in this policy. If these banks go bankrupt, if they're not savings banks, or if they're not regular banks, if they're speculative banks, there's no need in the world to give them anything. Bankrupt them. Put them out of business. We don't need them. Now, we do need some other kinds of banks, which we have samples of those, which are normal banks, U.S. banks under usual practices. Now, those institutions, which are essentially savings bank or something in related kinds of things, financing of projects, particular projects and so forth, that's what we need. We do not need any of these Wall Street banks. The sooner they die or are wiped out, the better. Because the minute you throw them out, because all you have to do is take them in and do a historical study. Okay, we want to talk to you about your banks. We want to know what your assets really are. Did you just simply roll over at an inflationary rate what you had not been able to pay for beforehand and demand more money? No, we look at your books and we don't find any balance there that warrants you're not being put into bankruptcy. Well, we're going to be merciful. We're going to bankrupt you. And what we're going to do is the federal government is going to go with a credit system, a national credit system. And a national credit system will go back to the regular kind of banking we used to have under Franklin Roosevelt and that sort of thing. And that's how we will make it. But first of all, the real thing in this, the problem of the United States is we don't produce much of anything. Our production facilities are closed. They are not productive. So why are they getting all this money when they are not productive? Their argument are that they're productive, but there's no evidence to show that they were. So obviously there's a fraud there, isn't there? So therefore it's up to the federal government to have a national bankruptcy reorganization process. Because we've got to save the nation and we've got to save the people. The speculators, we don't care what happens to them. We've had so much speculation by the speculators that it's more than up to everything we want to tolerate. If they all go bankrupt tomorrow morning, let them go bankrupt. They deserve it. Because we're going to save the nation, we're going to save the people who are decent people, who are engaged in legitimate investments, not these crooked ones. Wall Street should be closed down. The best thing to do is just shut Wall Street down totally. Because you can prove the fraud that they've perpetrated sufficiently to shut them down. You just have a government with the guts to do it. And that's my solution. Because I've got a bunch of people out there, Americans in particular. They're starving. They're being starved by this government. Children are being starved by this government. Adults are being crushed in great numbers, and it will increase the level at which are taken into this house. We have to save this nation, these people. That's our duty. And if they don't do that, they're not patriots. If they don't accept that, they're not patriots. And because they're not patriots, they must be thieves. And we have to take drastic measures of the type that Franklin Roosevelt took when he came into the presidency. Now, the best thing to do then is get Obama out of office, throw him out of office just to make sure, throw him through the window, put him on the basement. You throw him down there. But we're going to have to save our nation and these people, which are our people. That is the obligation of our government, to defend our people, to meet their needs. And all these members of Congress and so forth, who have any different idea, should quietly give up their position, and we can find some more people to replace them. Because the question here is, will this nation survive? Will the people of this nation survive? Right now, my guess is they wouldn't. However, if we throw these thieves and speculators, which are the same thing, out, we can reorganize the government. But we've got to get production going again. We've got to start producing food, which Obama has destroyed, the ability to produce food in the United States. So now he turns around and tries to starve your children to death. No, this is simple. What you have to do is go back to our Constitution and simply say nobody ever canceled that Constitution. They thought they did, but under our law, they didn't. They don't cancel our Constitution. But they were going to have to take the heat for what they're doing. But they've just got a mechanism which they're using. And that's the significance of the Snowden business. What it is, apparently what he's doing, he's simply unveiling the thievery which the federal government is thrusting on the American people. It's thievery. When you look, everything gets revealed, and they're complaining about this stuff. You're revealing our secrets. What's secret? Well, we're stealing, and you're trying to unmask it. Not a good plea, but that's what they're saying. Well, you have food shortage. Well, why aren't we producing more food? Why are we producing less food? Why are you taking food and turning it into alcohol for purposes of machinery? That's what the problem is. The facts are all there. There's an abundance of all the facts needed to prove the case. Why this president should be thrown out of office. It's not fast enough otherwise. Why banks that are speculative banks, why they should be closed down because they're thievery. They're ruining the nation. It's that simple. We're intimidated into submission to our own death.
All right. I have a question on guts, intimidation, and the institution of the presidency. This week, you have emphasized, as we've moved into the anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, that the focus must not be on the event per se, that he was killed, but the why of it, why he was killed, why it wasn't prevented, why the only presidents of the United States who have been killed in office were the ones carrying out the good of the nation in residence with the principles of the Constitution, while the scum and the riffraff flowed on through the executive office unmolested. Why we, the people, allow that. Now, as concerns President Kennedy, after the Cuban Missiles crisis had resolved in our favor, he privately joked to his brother Bobby that that night might be a good night to go to the theater. The reference being the Ford Theater, where Lincoln met with the end of his life. Now, despite that prescience, President Kennedy was assassinated in the open, in broad daylight. Now, in a discussion last night, you pointed out that under his administration, the United States had reestablished sovereignty. However more or less conscious this was to the people of the United States whether it be on the campuses to the high seats of government. That was a fact. And you also emphasized that the nature of empire and the nature of oligarchy is to crush sovereignty whenever it begins to flourish. Now, if we in the United States today act effectively to deal with the crisis, it's going to require the reassertion of our national sovereignty, the restoration of Glass-Steagall, the launching of a national mission in the form of a nuclear Nawapa 21, the genuine pursuit of thermonuclear fusion power on the schedule of a decade. All of these are possible. In fact, we won't get out of the crisis without them. All of them rely on exerting national sovereignty in the interests of the people of the United States. Now, looking toward the institution of the presidency after Barack Obama, this means that if we do have a presidency which does act in the interest of the people, they will have to face the same threat as the other presidents who have filled those shoes, the same threat that Kennedy faced. And I want to say, for the benefit of our audience, that in this week's edition of the Weekly Report, Michael Kirsch gives a very succinct overview of those presidents that then led off into a discussion with you, Lynn, on that. And that's available on the site. The question for you is, if we are able to put a real American presidency into place, given that any real American presidency which has been effective in as far as they've recognized and consciously fought against empire and oligarchy, what do we need to have at the forefront to keep that presidency alive, intact, and effective?
The problem is that we're not doing what we should be doing. The facts of this history are all available to us, the essential facts, enough to make the pattern clear. Now, what's happened? The United States, what was to become the United States in Massachusetts, had achieved independence and was the most progressive economy in the world. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, under its original sovereignty. What happened is the Anglo-Dutch operation, in this case the Dutch as such. It was the Dutch tyranny that suppressed the Massachusetts Bay Colony and crushed the colony. Once they crushed the mechanism, the sovereignty of the colony, then they went to work piece by piece to tear apart the parts of that economy. We then fought our way back through a great struggle, back and forth and so forth, with great leaders like Benjamin Franklin. And we secured our sovereignty in form. But what had happened? In the meantime, the Dutch Empire had taken over the British Kingdom. And they renamed the whole thing the British Empire. It was actually the Dutch operation which was the empire, and still is. So what we're dealing with is an international tyranny, the Anglo-Dutch tyranny. And it is a tyranny, and they use murder, mass murder. All these devices are used to try to maintain that kind of control. It was only as Nicholas Acusa had intended that the going across the Atlantic waters, or that was his specific, just going across the waters, that led to the protection of Europe from a greater disaster than had actually happened. So, that being the case, and we got power, we got our sovereignty, at least nominally, we got a constitution, but what was wrong? During the meantime, what had happened is that from the beginning of the 18th century, the Anglo-Dutch system of imperialism, which was moving in on India, for example, places like that, created a great amount of synthetic wealth for itself and began to parasitize on the world. And what happened in particular in North America, especially in the second half of that year, period, there was a pileup of British banks around New York, the New York City area, and in Boston, which is a relic of what had happened when the Dutch took over Boston. So therefore, whole thing was a theft, a fraud, in which the power of an empire, the empire that had just conquered India and other parts of the world, that was raping Africa and all such things, moved in and claimed its rights. And they would tell us that we Americans owed them debts. Why? What were the debts for? It was for the big banking interests, the Anglo-Dutch banking interests in Europe. They had established a grip to loot the people of the United States. Then they brought in Aaron Burr again, who was a real swine. He was a mass murderer. He was actually a British agent. But we had some damn fools who were presidents even, and they didn't pay any attention to that fact, that this was a looting operation. And it was not just this issue about Jackson. Jackson was only a symptom in the process. Don't overrate it. The point was to crush, and the means of the crushing was to use the international banking system to crush the U.S. economy. That's how it was done. To loot the banks of in the United States, to destroy them, and then to turn around and loot the United States. That's what happened. And we continued to be looted up to the time of the Civil War. But then what happened? As usual, the President of the United States was assassinated. Under British direction. Under British direction. It came from London. Our enemy. And you look at the list of presidents who were assassinated. And lo and behold, great mystery. Why was it that all the honest presidents were murdered? You go to the list of the murdered presidents. The murdered presidents were all murdered under the direction of the British monarchy and that system. Why don't we wake up? Why don't we wake up to truth? We know this? Okay. Why don't we do something about it? Now we have a new alliance is emerging in this world. It is centered in the Pacific region. Europe is looted. Germany is the last nation which has any remnants in Western and Central Europe, has any significant capability now. And they're trying to destroy Germany because that's an obstacle to what they want to get done. But that's where we're headed, in this direction. So therefore we have no resort except to use our national sovereignty and pass judgment upon what these foreign powers are. Now what we have is, what we have now. India is now being threatened with a nuclear assault from Saudi Arabia, which is really the British Empire. They aren't going to like it. They are a nuclear power. China is a nuclear power, as is demonstrated. Russia still has a nuclear power element in it. What's going to happen now? You're now going to try to crush these nations, national groups which are still viable, where the United States is no longer viable economically? That's what you're up against. Therefore, what we have to do now, by hook or by crook, as they say, we have to throw this system out. We have to foreclose on all these swindling banks. Look at the banks in Germany of question are swindlers. It's a complete fraud. It's been gone through. It's a complete fraud. Most of France was running a fraud. Now France is bankrupt too, because it frauded itself into destitute or something. So we have to start on the question of the consciousness of what reality is. If we don't understand and accept certain guidelines, you lose. Your case is hopeless. Either you fight these guys, either these nations fight against them, or you're all dead, as good as dead. Are you going to live? Do you have the guts to live? Do you have a sense of immortality? A sense that your life may terminate, but what's important is what your life has done for your successors? You don't have that kind of guts anymore in people. And they don't have even an idea of what they could be, what they could do. Looking at this in that frame of reference is the only way that you can ever come to an understanding of what you must now do. As many people before us in nations and parts of the world have done to try to save civilization, we too are called upon to save civilization and to save our own republic. If we have the guts to do that, that's good. But if you don't have the guts, what are you going to do? You're going to connive. You're going to try to make wheels and deals. You're going to connive. And what will that get you? The same thing has gotten you during most of the period since the assassination of John F. Kennedy. You've got nothing. Everything has been worse since John F. Kennedy was murdered. Everything is worse. There has been no progress in net in the U.S. economy since John F. Kennedy was assassinated. That's a fact. Then how do you suppose they beat us? With our own cowardice.
I want to ask a final question. I know we're going on the verge of an hour here, but I think this is an important issue to raise, and it's fascinating for me. I had a discussion with Ben Deniston earlier today, and that's sort of where this question came from. It's based off of a recent study that was just published, which proposes that the risk of city killer asteroids, collisions with these city killer asteroids of the type that exploded over Chelyabinsk, is much higher than was previously believed. According to previously accepted estimates, there were maybe 20 million of these asteroids that are on the Chelyabinsk sort of scale near Earth, these near-Earth objects. Now those estimates have been increased to anywhere between 60 to 200 million of these magnitude of near-Earth objects. So that means that scientists' previously accepted estimates of the frequency of these city-killer asteroids hitting Earth may have been off by an entire order of magnitude too low. And that would mean that the actual rates of hit would be an order of magnitude greater than previously thought. Now, this is not a definitive study, but what's very interesting is that this is a study which has been pursued according to a new method by an international group of scientists since the Chelyabinsk impact. Whereas previous studies of this type estimated the number of asteroids by taking a visual telescopic survey of what we could see in near-Earth space. Alternatively, another method was to take a average of the count of visible lunar impacts on the surface of the moon, and then average that out over time. This study is based on infrasound data, which was accumulated by the military over the past recent decades as part of a program to track missile launches and nuclear tests in the atmosphere. So, based on this data, the frequency of Chelyabinsk-type objects impacting our atmosphere is far more frequent than had previously been only visually observed. So, I think that this is fascinating in multiple ways. First of all, it indicates the insufficiency of relying on a single type of instrumentation. to give a mapping of these type of phenomena. Secondly, it presents an anomaly which the authors of the study say is increasingly suggestive of a non-equilibrium in the impactor flux of near-Earth asteroids. In other words, maybe this sampling, which was taken over just the past recent decades, is actually higher than the average impacts in the past. Maybe it is actually different in this bandwidth of time. So, if that's true, the question is, why would that be? And there are other indications of evidence of the existence of these types of anomalous increases in history, too. A scientist which is well known, Don Yeomans, who's one of the leading near-Earth object experts at JPL, said that there's strong evidence from the historical record to suggest that there was a significant increase in meteorite collisions in the years 1840 to 1880, above what was the average otherwise. And this data, which was noted at the time by contemporary scientists in the 19th century, 1840 to 1880, this data is confirmed by two completely different separate sets of data, one from Chinese astronomers and one from European astronomers from that time. So Yeomans asked the question, could there have been a change in the meteorite fall flux rate, actually? So the question that comes from all of this is, if indeed there are periodic anomalies of this type, would that not indicate a more organized dynamic structure of these asteroids than what's commonly assumed as just gas theory statistics? Could this type of flux frequency anomaly, the fact that there's more that come in at a certain period of time than just an average, could this be used to uncover a more organized process happening in intersolar space? And is this the type of understanding that would allow us to exert mass control over these objects as a process, as opposed to trying to just control each individual asteroid one by one? And then obviously the question that follows from there is, what gives mankind as a species the ability to exert this type of efficient, effective, creative control over such a huge volume of space? And what does that say about what the human species is?
It can mean a lot of things, a lot of different things, options. It can be a combination of things as well. The question is there a voluntary characteristic to this thing? Can you find a characteristic which is uniquely voluntary, where all other kinds of things cannot be attributed to this? I think that's one of the first things. But the other thing to do is, since this was over a period of time, this sort of says something about who would do that. Who is there out there who could do that and would try to do that? I would not exclude that. First of all, by no means would I exclude that, because it would be false. If you don't know something, you don't know it. If you don't know what might be doing that out there, controlling it, then you don't know what you're talking about. You've abandoned your purpose. The other thing is to try to find out what this may do in terms of a larger scale than simply the nearby solar system. Is it something which is controlled from outside the solar system? Is it a result of, what is outside the solar system? What this means is simply that we have to actually start putting things out there as experimental instruments to determine if there are these kinds of periodic things that we might suspect were arbitrary, rather than being batch. You get into a period where you're going through a whole stratum, and the solar system is going through that stratum, and periodically this thing gets in there in that fashion. But the point is, we obviously have to go to work and realize, as some of our greatest scientists did in the last generation, the last century, and just investigate. Put experimental devices out there which can do a finer-tuned estimation of what's going on out there. And also, in the meantime, also do a better job on estimating what we're up against in terms of even any incidental kind of pattern this time. The point is, we have to go there. My view on this, I think you're probably referring to this, my view is this, that we have to get out there. And we have to actually look at, don't try to put people on Mars, but put things on Mars. And put instruments up there and develop instruments which we can develop from Earth, put them on Mars, and we can build in some system which will actually look into things like this. So we have to actually put some things out there, which I've been proposing. Push things out there, sustain them, and have control over them in terms of supervision, and see what we can find. Obviously, the very fact, these facts you just referred to, are sufficient reason to say we should be doing that. And they'll say we can't do it, our economy. I'll say then all we have to do is shut down the swindling bankers, and we can do that easily. No, but we have to organize. We really have to be more serious about man in the solar system. I don't think we can do too much beyond that at this time. But we certainly can do a better job than we have not been doing right now. No, it really tantalizes me what you're reporting, because it's so obvious there's certain things we could be considering of doing, which we've been discussing anyway, the basement discussion and so forth, exactly this kind of thing. Yeah, it's a tempting subject matter.
I thought it would be. So, with that, I'm going to bring a conclusion to our broadcast tonight. And I want to thank Lynn a lot for joining us. And I want to thank our whole team here, Dennis, our production team, and everybody who was watching. So that brings a conclusion. Good night, and stay tuned.